its heyday, the Scott Colliery was one of the crowning achievements of the Anthracite Coal Region, as well as a source of pride for the people living in the community that had sprouted up alongside it. By 1928, the Federal Bureau of Mines listed the Scott Colliery as the second largest producer of anthracite coal in the entire region, thanks to the hard work of the 800-plus miners and laborers employed there. The Scott's success was Kulpmont's success, as newspapers of the time often cited it as the fastest-growing community in the entire state. Then, in the final weeks of 1928, a major squeeze was discovered in the mine workings. A squeeze occurs when the geological strata on top is heavier than the strata beneath. This causes the ceiling of the tunnels below to start sagging. Sometimes, adding extra load-bearing tinder props would rectify the situation. And other times, the ceiling would continue to buckle under the pressure from above until the tinders began snapping like toothpicks, causing a catastrophic failure of the mine workings below. Once a squeeze is discovered, state law mandates that all mining operations must come to a stop until a certified mine inspector can assess the structural integrity of the mine. It was quickly determined that the squeeze was irreconcilable and the Scott Colliery was a total loss. So, as fate would have it, in a cruel twist of irony, as the record-setting year of 1928 came to an end, so too did all mining operations at the Scott Colliery. Over the next few years, Susquehanna Coal, the Scott's parent company, would salvage anything of use from within the mine itself and the buildings on the surface. By August of 1932, all that remained of the once thriving mining operation were the two 1,000-foot deep mine shafts and the gutted wooden husk of the Scott Breaker. What had spent nearly 30 years proudly dominating Kulpmont's skyline had become an enormous eyesore in just under 3. Then, in the early morning hours of August 7th, 1932, the borough of Kulpmont was the scene of a powerful windstorm from the northeast. The Scott Breaker, which had been put together so finely that, when in operation, not a single vibration could be felt in the entire building, was paid a visit by the big bad wolf. With a huff and a puff, the borough of Kulpmont was awoken abruptly as a large section of the superstructure, now most of the 1.5 million feet of southern yellow pine, had been reduced to a hulking pile of rubble. While the windstorm gave the Scott Breaker a tummy tuck, the 198-foot and 10-inch spine of the breaker building, which had been supported by gigantic reinforcing poles, stubbornly remained standing. Nobody had been hurt in the dramatic act. However, newspapers of the time did claim that a herd of cattle had been lost to the collapse. And so the Scott Breaker would remain both an eyesore and a safety hazard for the next 11 months until an unknown group of children decided to make the Scott Colliery front page news one last time by giving it a record-setting send-off. Fittingly, it was the early evening of July 4th, 1933, when people in town noticed flames and smoke rising from the rubble of the Scott Breaker. No sooner had volunteers from both of Kulpmont's fire companies arrived on the scene that the order was given to stand down as the entire breaker was completely engulfed in flames. Despite being powerless to combat the conflagration unfolding before their eyes, fire crews would remain on the scene to monitor the situation just in case things started to get out of control. As the flames grew higher into the night, what had first been a local curiosity amongst the town folks was slowly beginning to draw in a crowd. The newspapers claimed that the fire could be seen from a whopping 50 miles away. From Kulpmont, that's as far away as Allentown to the east, Harrisburg and Lancaster to the south, Lock Haven to the west, Williamsport and Wilkes-Barre to the north. Our modern eyes may view this claim skeptically. However, we need to understand that the night sky in 1932 wasn't being drowned out by the immense amount of light pollution that our 21st century skies suffer from. The longer it burned, the more curiosity seekers began to flood the streets and sidewalks of Kulpmont. In fact, as the crowds grew, officials in the borough had to block off several streets so as to not affect through traffic on Kulpmont's main street, PA State Route 122. The fire burned throughout the night and into the next day for about 12 hours in total. As the fire began to wane, so too did the crowd of curiosity seekers, and before they knew it, it was business as usual in the former coal region boomtown. By dinner time on July 5th, the 1.5 million feet of southern yellow pine had been reduced to a smoldering pile of ash. For one last time, the Scott Breaker was front page news. Amongst the handful of local newspapers available from the time period, the most comprehensive coverage is from the July 5th, 1933 Shamokin Dispatch Evening Edition. But our story doesn't end here. Actually, it's the beginning of a long-forgotten source of pride for the borough of Kulpmont. According to the Shamokin Dispatch, quote, "But it remained for Kulpmont to boast what is believed to have been the largest bonfire in American history," unquote. Back then, world records weren't documented as thoroughly as they are today. So, let's examine the facts from a modern perspective to see how well the Shamokin Dispatch's boisterous claims hold up to historical scrutiny. According to a first-hand account from Angie Tim, a lifelong resident of Kulpmont, who remembers the events of this story like they were yesterday, quote, "The belly of the breaker collapsed like a bunch of matchsticks, but the spine of the breaker defiantly remained intact," unquote. That would mean that at the time of the bonfire, the structure would have stood at 198 feet and 10 inches. According to the Guinness Book of World Records, quote, "The tallest bonfire is 198 feet and 11 inches tall and was achieved in Austria on March 16, 2019, unquote. Ergo, after taking all of the evidence into consideration, this historian can confidently say that as of July 4th, 1933, Kulpmont, Pennsylvania would have had a legitimate claim to being home to the largest bonfire in the world title, until the Austrian bonfire would have taken the title away from it by 1 inch 85 years later.